The Remedial Herstory Project is a nonprofit working to get women's history into the primary and secondary history curriculum. To help us meet our goal, we produce media, lesson plans, and so much more. You can check it out on our website, www.remedialherstory.com. Our project is funded through grants and by patrons, potentially like you.
Thank you to our patrons Jeff, Barbara, Christian, Kent, Jamie, Jenna, Nancy, Megan, Leah, Mark, Nicole, Anne, Sarah, Alicia, Katya, Michelle, Jessica, Laura, and Jackie.
If you would like to join these wonderful people and become a patron, you can head over to patreon.com and become a supporter of the Remedial Herstory Project. You too can help us reform education and allow women to be seen, heard, and complicated.
Hey, Kelsie.
Hey, Brooke.
Want to tell everyone what's happening in today's episode?
Today, we are going to be talking about women in French imperialism.
Oh, all right. Let's get into this.
Hello, and welcome to Remedial Herstory, the other 50%, the podcast that explores what happened to the women in history class. Now, here's your host, Kelsie Brooke Eckert, and her partner in crime, Brooke Neva Sullivan.
In this episode, we are going to be asking the question, were French women willing participants or collateral damage in imperialism? And we have Dr. Jack Gronau with us to talk about it.
Ooh, okay. Tell me about Dr. Jack Gronau.
Well, he is a professor at Northeastern University.
Very cool.
So just down in Boston and cozying up with us in these winter months because it is cold in New England
these
days.
Lots of snow.
But
Okay.
he is an expert on French imperialism, and in particular, he's fascinated by the women who were in this period because women sometimes are overlooked. Shocking.
Oh, you just blew me away with the fact.
But Brooke, the imperial era.
I know, I was going to pause you. Can we explain what that is?
Sure. So imperialism is when a country expands their influence politically, militarily, economically, etc.
Expansion,
yes.
Of
Typically, they're taking over either industries or land owned by other people.
Okay. So like building an empire.
Building an empire.
Okay.
And yeah, a good, like, the classic example would be like the English, the sun never sets on the English empire, that sort of thing.
Yes.
But Americans were sort of like sneaky imperialists, where we did have a period in the late 1800s. Well, Native Americans would say like forever, but there's a period
Accurate.
that is considered our imperial era, where we expanded borders beyond just the West and into the Philippines and Hawaii, and we talked about that on our episode on Hawaii. But we continued expanding our influence well beyond that period, but our influence was more political and economic rather than like taking over land. Yeah. And so like a good example of American imperialism, you could argue, this is an argument, is that we have military bases all over the world.
Right.
Right? Like imagine if China had a military base like right down the road. Like, no.
Like who would allow that?
Yeah.
It is very shocking every time people are like, oh yeah, no, we're going to Okinawa, which is like a huge military base. And you're just like, how are they cool with that?
Yeah.
So many Americans on...
Well, Japan's sort of a different issue because they don't have their own military to defend themselves.
This is true.
But yeah, so French imperialism is really part of the French Republic. And then there's several periods of it. There's late imperialism. And he's going to talk about women in different parts of that.
Okay.
But women they're overlooked in topics related to imperialism because so much of it has to do with the military leaders, the president,
politics.
and the king or whatever, and their decision. And what's interesting though is like as you expand into those places, women are going with those people, like their wives and whatever. And so women are definitely like part of it. And I love his question, are they willing participants? Are they like on board with the imperial mission? Or are they just sort of like collateral damage?
And this period of time that we're talking about for France, are they still a monarchy or they have a president?
So, well, that's a great question. France, so we're really talking about like 1800, and he says that, it could go all the way up to like post-World War II.
Okay.
But France has several different types of revolutions in that time. And so different, different
like who's in charge is
who's
different.
in charge might shift over time, but the idea of let's expand and create this strong France, right? Like that doesn't really shift.
Vive la France!
Yes. That was excellent.
Thank you.
And
I took French in high school.
The French people listening are probably like,
ew.
Ew. Ew, Brooke.
Le no.
I did talk with Dr. Gronau about our bad French language skills. So, although he is better than me.
My French is probably better than my Spanish, which I took way more years of. But, yeah, definitely sound like an American trying out a shoe that doesn't fit.
Bonjour now. Anyway, so I'm so excited to have Dr. Gronau with us today. And why don't we have him introduce himself?
Hi, my name is Jack Gronau, and I'm a university lecturer at Northeastern University in Boston, Massachusetts. I want to first thank you, Kelsie, for asking me to be a contributor to the Remedial Herstory project. This kind of curriculum expansion and development is such important work, and there's still so much work that needs to be done when it comes to making the study of history and the teaching of history from elementary school right up through undergraduate a more inclusive field that reflects the past experiences and actions and ideas of all people. So women in particular, being half or even more of the population then and now, are overdue for equitable representation in mainstream history. So this project is a great step in the right direction. Like I first said, I'm currently a lecturer at Northeastern, where I'm teaching several undergraduate courses in European and world history, one of which is race, gender, and medicine that I'm developing for next semester. But I've been at Northeastern for quite some time, actually, because it's where I very recently completed my PhD in history as well. I defended in August 2021. My project was French women's civil society activism, civic and political struggles in Imperial France, 1897 to 1942. That's always how you know it's a dissertation and not a book, because the subtitle is so long, but, we're getting there. It's one of my current projects I'm working on. My research centers on the French Empire during the Third Republic and how French women's civil society organizations participated in the imperial project, both in the colonies and the metropole, and how the empire influenced their discourse and activities. But I've been interested in and have studied many different points in history that all kind of culminated in my current research interests and field of study. Since high school, I knew, I wanted to study and teach history. My love for history was part, this innate curiosity and interest in it, but it was also certainly fostered by a series of great teachers I had as well. And so as an undergrad, I declared, secondary education in history, and I began to focus primarily on World War II Europe, and specifically Nazi Germany. But I took an upper-level seminar on modern France, and I think this is really what planted the seed for some of my future studies. When I entered Northeastern's PhD program sometime later, I already knew I wanted my research to center on the Francophone world. The program at Northeastern really fosters a strong world history angle too. So when combined with my growing interest in women and gender studies, this kind of brought these different pieces of the puzzle together for me. I read Antoinette Burton's Burdens of History my first year, and in that book she analyzes how British feminists used the plight of the colonized Indian woman to validate their own feminist agenda with demands for equality in the metropole and participation in the empire. And this early reading is what really kind of sparked this line of inquiry for me with this project, because I looked around and thought, France is the second largest world empire during this period in the mid-19th through early 20th century, but there's been really no focus on the role of French women, aside from what's been studied on early, Catholic missionary work or, the singular lives of individual women. So I thought if British women, feminists, and others had such an outsized role in the British imperial project, and that this is something that had been well documented amongst historians and had really turned into a burgeoning field. British women as these kind of agents of colonialism, what were French women doing? Was it similar or different? And, why might this difference be the case? So I think you have to start by unpacking the historical significance of this period in history, not only for France, but globally. So this period is the late 19th century through roughly World War II. In many ways, you can think about it as almost the entirety of the French Third Republic, which was from 1870 to 1940. This is the period of new imperialism, characterized by heightened colonial expansion of European powers, as well as the entry of the US and Japan into this kind of race for empire building. This is also in the throes of massive industrialization and urbanization, the expansion of the global economy and markets. This is also the birth of kind of a modern consumer culture, which was really unparalleled in France's modern history. This rise in consumerism, whether it was, the bon marché, these kind of cathedrals of consumption, as Colin Jones has kind of called them, or cafes or restaurants or nightclubs, this was a really significant development and impacted the lives of everyday men and women pretty significantly, particularly, bourgeois French women of kind of the middle and upper class. This also came to symbolize a kind of deviation from traditional gender norms as well, this kind of blurring of the boundaries of public and private between races and social classes and genders. So this was, a really unique time in France as well as across Europe as well, and particularly in some of the larger, urban areas where you see the birth of kind of this modern cosmopolitanism. But this is also a period that encompasses the First World War, where we see the collapse of 4 major empires and the redrawing of national boundaries and borders, not to mention unprecedented levels of violence and destruction and the emergence of chemical warfare. And then consequently, the interwar period, which was marked by the rise of communism following the Russian Revolution, as well as the rise of fascism and this kind of rampant ultranationalism. You also have the Great Depression beginning in 1929, and you also have the marked increase of independence movements in the overseas colonial territories of the British and French Empire as well. In France, in particular, this period from 1897 through, 1942 was one of tremendous political, social, and economic change, with the French Empire reaching its territorial height. And this period is also synonymous with the multifaceted French feminist movement as well. Individuals and organizations began to conceptualize very different interpretations of what they believed feminism was and what its goal should be. Feminism in the Third Republic, it's often been characterized as, this really disjointed movement of many organizations and a spectrum of identities and ideologies and activities, and in many ways it was. But out of this, milieu emerged the dominant form of French feminism, which was bourgeois Republican feminism. The rhetoric of these feminists centered on, principles stemming from the Enlightenment, from the French Revolution, these kinds of Rousseauist conceptions of good government and natural rights, French Republican ideas of justice and democracy and equality. And, women began to use a lot of these ideas to create pragmatic political arguments that positioned, their increased enfranchisement alongside, these kind of sweeping contributions to French society that they were making. And so bourgeois Republican feminists, who made up really the majority of feminists in France, throughout the entirety of the Third Republic, really strongly identified with their position as French women in French society, pursuing civil and political rights in this kind of framework of the secular French nation state. But specific notions of gender were also really important and profoundly influenced their feminist discourse as well. It's during this period where gender was constructed as, this complementary, part of a binary relationship between men and women, where, difference or the idea of difference was seen as the cornerstone that situated men and women in these kind of separate spheres of public and private. So bourgeois Republican feminists really supported, the sexual division of labor at home and in society, and they often emphasized, what they called kind of, quote, the special nature of women, these kinds of qualities that they would attribute to, women's maternal instincts and mothering and nurturing, things of that nature. So this was the predominant feminist discourse of the Third Republic, and it really mirrored the period's sociocultural gender framework as well. Alongside the expansion of the French feminist movement was also this massive mobilization of French laywomen into faith-based organizations that were aimed at social and religious reform. World War I ushered in a tremendous upsurge of women's social movements, which, even though they had begun decades earlier, really took off following World War I, and nowhere was this more apparent than amongst Catholic women.
Hey, Kelsie, I don't think our listeners know about the new upcoming project that we're working on.
Which one?
The video series.
Oh, the video series. That's awesome.
I know. So I thought we could tell them a little bit about what the project is, how it's funded, and what the purpose is.
Well, we are producing a video series, 25 episodes on U.S. history, 25 episodes on world history. And the point of these is to provide teachers who don't know women's history with like a 10-minute video that they could play for their class. So say you're teaching a lesson on the American Revolution. Here's 10 minutes about women in that time period.
Amazing.
And it could be a foundation that you can springboard from and do something really cool on those women.
And these videos are, yes, but they are fully scripted. You can look at the scripts. They're nicely edited with some really great content.
Yep. They're vetted by historians, 2 PhDs at least in history. So, people smarter than me.
But they're going to be free, and they're on YouTube.
And they'll be on YouTube. They also have a comedian from Hollywood who is helping to make them funny. So it's, because I'm like kind of boring.
No, very funny. But that's awesome. So they're really engaging and they're really cool content. So more to come there. So we have those coming out. And those are funded through grants? Through our patrons.
Okay. So their, contributions to us through Patreon are supporting that project. And then we also have a lot of people that have been donating through Instagram, Facebook. We have a Venmo account. You can find us there.
That's awesome.
And they're making those contributions. So yeah, it's an amazing thing. And if this is something that you're like, yes, that's what teachers need, every penny helps because it is a really expensive project. So.
Totally. And we had a match donor for a while there too, which is really cool. So definitely if you're interested in those, feel free to donate. You can donate right on our website, Instagram, and Venmo.
Yeah.
Which is awesome. Great work. I'm excited to see the rest of those videos.
Oh, Brooke, thanks for your support of the project.
Awesome.
So in the years following the war, France ushered in a variety of socioeconomic policies that would create the foundation for the modern welfare state. And in its efforts to, recover from the economic and social and even corporal effects of the war, France began to embark on policy provisions and public debates that really centered on the social role of French women, from women's right to work and protective labor legislation to draconian measures that restricted birth control access and even outlawed abortion. So this period, I think it's important to really underscore a lot of the moving parts that are taking place both, domestically in France as well as globally. Because for French women, especially the interwar period, really marks a watershed moment where women are beginning to receive kind of a larger admittance to the political sphere. And women's civil societies more generally are also being largely politicized because of the general, socio-political environment in France as well as throughout Europe. And so it's in this period that I examine these three women's civil society organizations. The first being the French Women's Colonial Emigration Society, the second being the Civic and Social Women's Union, which was a conservative social Catholic association that was created following World War I in 1925. And the third is the Union for French Women's Suffrage, which was an explicitly bourgeois Republican feminist organization. And all three of these organizations are very different, but they're woven together by their shared struggle for French women's civil or political rights, sometimes both of these things, as well as their attempt to carve out a unique space for women within the sociocultural and political sphere of the Third Republic and its empire. So I use gender as kind of, the primary analytic framework here to relocate the history of French women's civil society organizations in this kind of imperial context, which is really something that is kind of pretty unique to my project, I think, because this is really not something that has often been done to kind of blend these two fields that are typically studied kind of within silos of one another. But I think it's necessary to do this, to kind of frame these groups in an imperial context in order to better understand how the relationships between French women and imperial culture as well as colonialism kind of influenced and interacted with one another. There was this kind of experience of empire that permeated French women in both the metropole and in the colonies, but in very unique ways that were really also influenced by, the sociocultural and political landscape of the space that they were living in, whether it was a settler colonial environment in the French Maghreb, or whether it was in metropolitan France. So digging a little bit deeper into, the activities and mission of these various organizations. The first one, being the Women's Colonial Emigration Society. This was established in 1897, operated through, roughly 1911. And I chose this society because it's only one of two to appear in France, even during its brief years of activity, but also because of the different role that this organization really took on. My examination, I think, kind of complicates our understanding of the organization. It really looks into a lot of the gendered rhetoric that male colonialists used here, where they really framed this as this kind of matrimonial agency, really helping to assist the immigration of French women of a certain kind of social class to settler colonies to marry and have children with French men, which, of course, at this time was really part of a kind of broader pronatalist movement that was going on, that really conceptualized, the empire as this kind of population reservoir for the nation. And that, a lot of this was also driven by these very, racist concerns of what was known then as, this quote unquote racial degeneration of, French male settlers having children with indigenous women and having mixed race offspring and, producing in the minds of many French, politicians and government officials, kind of the wrong kinds of French people, were reproducing. And so sending, middle-class French women to the colonies was seen as a way to kind of right this trend. But I also, in looking at the society, focus on the leadership of the Secretary General, Marie-Joséphine Péguer, and, this kind of understated feminist discourse that she created around the society. She positioned the Emigration Society as a vehicle, really, for women's social mobility, as kind of a means that they could use to provide them with employment as well as kind of life opportunities within the colonies. And that also in, highlighting kind of the way in which under her leadership, she sought to kind of reposition the activities of this society. I also think it demonstrates how male colonialists really were using women's colonial emigration for the purposes of political arguments, basing it really on this largely fictional narrative of kind of this, crisis of gender roles, quote unquote, and there not being enough jobs to go around for, all of these, middle-class women that were now receiving an education and entering the workforce, and, all of these very classist and inherently patriarchal, misogynistic arguments that were being made. The second group that I focus on, the Civic and Social Women's Union, which was the Conservative Catholic Union, is really special in the sense that there have been, a number of historians that have focused on this group, who is actually has changed over time, but is still, some semblance of this organization is still active today. They've focused on this group and their activities, all throughout France. But it's also noteworthy that this group really created this decentralized network that, set up branches across the French Empire. 6 of their 57 groups, by 1942, were stationed overseas. And this is something that has really been overlooked in, the history of this organization. The group created 2 newspapers, one that was in metropolitan France and another that was in French Algeria. And so, placing, the Catholic Union within this kind of imperial context, illuminates this kind of secondary, lesser-known agenda of the organization that really has escaped the attention of a lot of scholars. And this is a kind of, feminine civilizing mission that was aimed at both European settlers and indigenous women in French overseas territories. And these imperial activities, included thousands of members across branches that were established in Morocco, Tunisia, Madagascar, and most significantly in French Algeria. So 2 themes emerge from the organization's colonial program. The first is a focused effort on raising the living standards for French settler women and fostering a sense within them that they were conduits of French civilization who needed to build mutual relationships with indigenous women there for, quote, the good of the empire and the future of France. But the Catholic Union, their colonial program for French settler women also established social welfare and education programs, such as courses in childcare and sewing, setting up elderly rest homes, youth centers, summer camps. So where settler populations were particularly substantial, which was in the French Maghreb, particularly in Algeria, these colonial groups created, libraries and community centers, setting up employment assistance for settler women, all kinds of different activities, many of which mirror what was happening in the metropole. But for whatever reason, no one has really kind of looked at the ways in which these groups kind of extended those social missions that they were doing in the metropole to kind of the colonial space. The second theme that emerges is, a concern for indigenous women and girls, often displayed in members' concerted efforts to learn and understand local indigenous culture and language, which was often followed by these kinds of social and educational initiatives that would benefit these women and their communities. Issues of concern often centered on living standards, on the education of young girls, on childcare, on maternal aid. And, the rhetoric and the initiatives that developed were really rooted in this commitment to the Imperial Civilizing Mission and kind of colonial extension of the metropole's flourishing social Catholicism movement. But it's important to point out that the French colonial policy of, the civilizing mission, mission civilisatrice, rested on notions of the superiority of French civilization, of the kind of perfectibility of humankind and the right and duty of France to, as it saw it, remake primitive cultures, along lines inspired by the cultural, political, and economic development of France. So they are these very problematic, racist, Eurocentric notions that were guiding French colonial policy during this period that many French women really went along with and used as an opportunity through these civil society organizations to kind of create new opportunities for white European women, not all of which was inherently, women didn't necessarily support these things for, it wasn't always inherently negative purposes. White French women that were participating in these civil societies weren't necessarily co-opting and participating in the imperial project it wasn't always these inherently negative intentions, but it is important to note, because I think this is also a big part of the history that is lost in the fact that women have often not been included in discussions over empire building during this period, is the fact that they did blend notions of a civilizing mission with their own kind of practices that sought, greater enfranchisement and opportunity. And Arab Muslim women, particularly in Algeria, continued to play a vital role in French colonial projects and in the work of both the Catholic Union as well as the French Women's Union for Suffrage. In both of those cases, even for different purposes, they were often seen as key to the success of the French civilizing mission and to the maintenance of colonial order and good relations between the settler community and the indigenous community. And lastly, the third distinct group is the French Union for Women's Suffrage, which was, again, this overtly feminist organization created with the explicit purpose of working towards achieving female suffrage. They had a very important presence throughout the French Maghreb during the 1930s interwar period. Even if many of their efforts were unsuccessful, the fact that there was this kind of attempt made to mobilize French women, either sending members from the Union from the metropole to be active in the French Maghreb, or organizing those women who were already living in the area, but attempting to both incorporate French women in the larger feminist movement for white French women to achieve suffrage and greater, civil and political rights, but also in using indigenous women as a part of that program as well, much in the same way that British feminists used Indian women to argue for greater enfranchisement as well, highlighting the work of French women within the colonial order, specifically in Algeria, also kind of reinforces the fact that European settler women position the delivery of social services to indigenous women as fulfillment of their role as French civilizers, as these kind of conduits of the civilizing mission, which again is an important aspect of empire building that is often overlooked in the history. So for far too long, histories of French colonialism and women's civil society organizations, they've been studied in silos, kind of, as I've said, with French feminist studies relegated to the metropole. But I think these three unique civil society groups with their, varying, missions and beliefs and goals that were really influenced by colonialism and the specter of empire as well, demonstrate how central notions of womanhood were within both metropolitan France and its colonies, and as well as how many women co-opted mission civilisation as a means for arguing for greater civil and political liberties for French women at home and throughout the empire, as well as using it as an opportunity to participate in, this very patriotic way, participating in kind of building a stronger France, which I think also speaks to kind of the very complicated ways that identity and gender and colonialism and all of these different concepts and ideas kind of play off of each other. But ultimately, I think, French women and their respective organizations had a complex relationship with the French Empire, specifically in the colonial Maghreb. And I think analyzing French women's participation in the imperial project through a kind of gender and settler colonial lens reveals a lot of these long ignored dimensions of civil society organizations in Third Republic France, and that it establishes kind of the greater potential for the field for further investment, but also underscores kind of these long ignored aspects of history during this period that has often overlooked the various ways European women, and in this case French women, contributed to empire building, to the building of settler colonies in these overseas territories, and how oftentimes the imperial project was then co-opted by these organizations to argue for greater civic and political rights and liberties back home as well. Thanks.
Oh, thank you so much for your time and energy. I learned so much from you in that. And I kept thinking about all of these connections to things that I teach, whether it be the French Revolution or, other forms of imperialism from different countries. And I am just in awe of your research. This is so cool.
Thanks.
I would love to know a little bit. You talked about how these women from France had this civilization mission that could be seen in some ways as kind, but they also used their role in civilizing to push their own enfranchisement back home. And I would love if you could just expand on that idea a little bit, because I see that in other cultures around the world as well. And it's such an interesting moment for women's history.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the Civilizing Mission, at least in kind of the French case, it certainly kind of takes on different forms within like British imperialism and American imperialism. I think it's often in those cases framed as kind of the white man's burden with Rudyard Kipling's poem, or seen as kind of like the 3 C's of like Christianity, commerce, and civilization. But in the French case, it's very much kind of based in Republican ideology and the notion that the French kind of invented, if you will, civilization, and that it's something that can be taught and kind of sculpted through language and culture and educations and raising standards of living for people. And this certainly kind of changed and shifted over time. But I think during this period of new imperialism, French women are like kind of adopting and using this ideology as a means to kind of create, whether it's like greater economic or social opportunity for themselves, or in efforts to kind of extend their efforts at philanthropy and social welfare programs. So kind of like extending a lot of the social and philanthropic work that they were doing in France, extending that to the colonies, especially, French Algeria. And then also the women's suffrage movement. French feminists kind of and disagreeing as well, those that were living in French Algeria versus those that were in the metropole, of how that would kind of play out. But certainly kind of using their role in the colonies and the spread of civilization to argue for their rights for greater, political and civil rights in France.
I love the question that you shared with me. French women, willing participants or collateral damage? And if I had to pose that question to you, what would be your answer?
Yeah, I would say it's a both and, that they were certainly willing participants in the sense that they often embodied and sought to carry out the civilizing mission, whether it was through their work with colonial administrators in the colonies or these various kinds of social welfare programs that were directed at indigenous communities. A lot of that was in the name of spreading French culture and civilization and French language. So education was used as a big tool to kind of spread the civilizing mission. But also they were kind of collateral damage in the sense that oftentimes their attempts and activities were thwarted because they were confined by whether it was kind of the settler colonial environment or kind of their place as white European middle upper class women. They were confined to these very gendered and raced expectations, where especially in the settler colonial setting, they were expected to kind of live and breathe and be the embodiment of civilization. So it was often them that were responsible for continuing to maintain and reinforce spatial and physical boundaries between white settlers and indigenous people of color. And this was something that hampered their ability oftentimes to be able to make a lot of meaningful, impactful change for both French settler women as well as indigenous women. And this is certainly the case for the expansion of, the suffrage movement and the colonies in particular.
I love that idea of having to be the embodiment of civilization too. What incredible pressure. But we
no big deal.
The way that, women are used as symbols, whether it be Lady Liberty or Lady Justice or Manifest Destiny, right? Those sort of images of women's bodies, right, representing these huge ideals are everywhere. So I think that's such a meaningful thing to convey and also question with students. So I love that. I love this whole topic because it touches and crosses so much of what we do as educators. I'm curious, given that this is your research and your background, you're probably more familiar with how to find these tools than maybe, a K-12 educator is. So where would you direct them to find things that they could have their students look at or read to more deeply understand the topic?
Yeah. So when it comes to primary sources, a topic like this is somewhat limited by folks' ability to read French. So if that is something that teachers have in their wheelhouse, my biggest suggestion would be to take a look at BNF, the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. That is kind of the French National Library, where they have a system called Gallica. And through that system are just thousands of digitized documents, photographs. One of the things that I found most useful in my research is the newspapers that have been digitized. They have specifically a section on kind of women's, more cultural, socialite type papers, but also specifically feminist press. And this is digitized and broken out by year. It's searchable by keywords and stuff through PDF. It's free, which is huge. With technology, you can use Google Translator to kind of get at pieces of it as well. So if that's something that folks kind of have in their wheelhouse, that's definitely a great tool to utilize, a lot of those press.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, and you also have the French teacher down the hall. You can always utilize them. I'm sure they would love to support.
Very true. Yes.
They always get so excited whenever I'm like, oh, I'm talking about France today. They're always like, woohoo!
C'est bon.
Oh, yeah, I barely speak French, but I would always go in and fake it. And all the, middle schoolers or whoever was in there at the time would be very impressed. And I was really grateful that they were impressed because no one else would be.
Ditto. That's how I feel oftentimes too. So no worries.
Oh, well, thank you so much for your time and research. This is so cool. And I can't wait for more people to teach a more inclusive imperialism history. And I love just this. There's so many layers of race and class and colonialism, so many things that can be investigated with this. And I can't wait for people to do it better.
Yeah, no, it's my pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for having me. I think this period too, like the period of new imperialism, is something that is often not taught in secondary education. And I think it provides a lot of opportunity to get at not only the role of women, but to look at it from this kind of intersectional perspective and get at all of these issues of race and class and colonialism, and ethnicity, and reshape the narrative, because empire building is often seen as this very masculine endeavor. And especially during the new imperialism era, that is certainly not the case. So I think there's a lot of potential here.
Yeah. And it's, I love that you brought up the masculine thing, because it's a way that white women have sort of passed the blame to white men and, and hidden.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Gotta face that too.
Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you so much.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to Remedial Herstory, the other 50%. Please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to your podcasts to bring more voices to the conversation. We really appreciate that effort. Until next time.